of 17th and 18th December 2015. I now give the floor to the President of the Council of the Union, Mr. Donald Tusk.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear President, members of the European Parliament, the December European Council debated, in fact, all the major crises that confronted Europe in 2015. Whether it was the refugee and migration crisis, EMU reform or Brexit, in all of these discussions we made some progress, but for sure not enough. Let us have no doubt that 2016 will also be overshadowed by these challenges. Our community is experiencing a stress test, and what is most challenging is that we are being tested on all possible fronts at the same time. Today, let me say it loud and clear. I will not rest until we work out solutions to all these challenges. Our strength comes from our unity. Therefore, keeping European unity will continue to be my main goal in 2016. Dear members, let me start with migration and refugee crisis, the existential challenge for the EU. As you remember, I have emphasized for months, in fact from the very beginning of the migration crisis, that there is no good alternative to border protection. This is a conditio sine qua non of any effective migration policy. Unless we can guard Europe's external border properly, we will fail as a political community. After the December European Council, we can be a bit more optimistic. The leaders' discussion concentrated on ways and means of strengthening external border control. All leaders acknowledge that protecting Schengen requires difficult decisions. In this context, we agreed to rapidly examine the European Commission's proposal of strengthening the EU's external borders, including the idea of the European Border Guard. This is the priority of the Dutch presidency, and we should have political agreement in the Council by June. The agreement by Greece to accept a rapid border intervention team from Frontex already in December is another indication that we have started to move in the right direction when it comes to guarding the external border. Despite political progress, I have to admit that there is a clear delivery deficit on many fronts, from hotspots and the security screening in frontline countries to relocation and returns. The action plan with Turkey, although promising, is still to bear fruit. I share the sentiment expressed by Prime Minister Rutte that we have no more than 2 months to get things under control. The statistics over the Christmas period are not encouraging, with over 2,000 arrivals to the EU per day, according to Frontex. The March European Council will be the last moment to see if our strategy works. If it doesn't, we will face grave consequences such as the collapse of Schengen. For sure, this kind of alternative to our strategy is not pleasant, and so I appeal the Member States implement the strategy in full. Dear members, let me turn to the UK. In December, leaders had a substantive and constructive discussion on the UK question. Prime Minister Cameron set out his position in detail, in particular regarding benefits and free movement. He explained his request for a model based on 4 years and reiterated the openness to alternative solutions, but only if they achieve the same objective. Leaders voiced their concerns on specific issues, but also demonstrated willingness to look for compromises. Building on this positive debate, we agreed to work together to find solutions in all four baskets raised by Prime Minister Cameron: relations with the euro area, sovereignty, competitiveness, and on benefits and free movement. Hard work on all these baskets is progressing, and as we speak, my people are working with the Commission to bring us closer to the solution. In the run-up to the February European Council, I will table a concrete proposal of a deal with the UK to all the EU leaders. Let me stress again that from the very beginning of these negotiations, I have been very clear. There will be no compromise on fundamental values like non-discrimination and free movement. At the same time, I will do everything in my power to find a satisfactory solution also for the British side. As of today, the result of the referendum is more unpredictable than ever before. Time is of essence here, and this is why I will work hard to strike the deal already in February. It will not be easy, but it is still possible. Dear members, the European Council also discussed counter-terrorism in light of the Paris tragedy. These outrageous acts only have strengthened Europe's resolve to fight terrorism. Leaders agreed to operationalize our policies, including systematically sharing information on foreign fighters through Schengen and Europol, as well as between member state authorities. Security services should conduct a joint threat analysis if it can prevent future attacks. Europol has already reported a significant rise in information exchange on foreign fighters through its new counter-terrorism centre, with almost every member state contributing data. Without vigilance and real cooperation, we cannot defeat this threat, and the likelihood of further attacks remains very high. I urge all states to cooperate fully. Dear colleagues, the European Council was an opportunity for the leaders to assess the state of play in building the energy union. There is a significant progress in the level of interconnections between states on the gas and electricity markets, including the parts of Europe that have been isolated until now. When I proposed the energy union concept as Polish Prime Minister, this was one of my major goals. I am happy to see a clear progress, but still we need more. The European Council asked for all relevant legislation to be brought forward, including of strengthening the transparency on the gas market. Talking about the energy union, leaders had an exchange on the Nord Stream 2 project. Some of them were very critical. And we also discussed the conditions that need to be met by major energy infrastructure projects. We reiterated that any new infrastructure should be fully in line with the energy union objectives, not to mention the obvious obligation that all projects have to comply with all EU laws, including the third energy package. These are clear conditions for receiving support from the EU institutions or any member state, political, legal or financial. Now the ball is in the court of the European Commission, but the political message of the European Council is clear and goes in a similar direction as the position expressed by the European Parliament. Leaders praised President Hollande and congratulated him on the successful hosting of the COP21 and on the agreement of the first ever legally binding global climate deal. We have asked the Commission and the Council to assess fully what the Paris Agreement implies for our own energy and climate policy mix. Last but certainly not least, the European Council addressed economic challenges. Leaders confirmed their commitment to work towards completing EMU further based on the 5-President report. Even if Europe is overwhelmed by the migration crisis, we cannot afford to wait with the necessary EMU reforms for better days. In this spirit, ministers were asked to advance their work rapidly on a number of areas, including the banking union. The European Council also emphasised the importance of deepening the single market in key areas. Delivering a digital single market and building a capital markets union is our top priority. Dear members, finally, I want to warn against the increasingly alarmist rhetoric on the future of Europe. Neither naivety nor excessive pessimism will get Europe the results it needs. As Europeans, we have to be both realistic and confident about our values and beliefs. I am reminded of Arnold Toynbee's famous remark that civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. Europe is stronger than some may think, and we still have the power and the public mandate to do what is necessary. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tusk. Now, on behalf of the Commission, I give the floor to Mr. Juncker.
Präsident, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen, and members of the Council,
following the choice comments of the President of the European Council, if I were to summarize in a nutshell the conclusions of the Council on Migration, Terrorism, Economic and Monetary Union, the United Kingdom, via external relations, I would say they perfectly reflect a Europe which is very much embroiled in crisis. In recent months, we've said a lot about the Greek crisis, the refugee crisis, and other crises. But in fact, Europe is facing a conjunction of a multiplicity of complex crises at many levels, posed from outside and within the European Union, all of which are occurring at the same time. We clearly find ourselves in difficult circumstances which require us to break out of national selfishness and return to the pioneering spirit of the process of building Europe, including solidarity. If we so choose, we can provide a responsible European response, showing solidarity to the multiplicity of crises we face. We can do this, and it's our duty to do so, since only more European solidarity will allow each of our countries to overcome their various crises. This is crucial if we wish to preserve what we have enjoyed up until now, such as our single market or the Schengen zone. It's vital also if we wish to come up with the missing elements that we need to build Europe. The President has already put forward the various elements we need if we're to fight the refugee crisis with adequate urgency. If the Member States had implemented the policy we had put forward, we'd be in a much better situation than we now are. That's why when I hear people saying that there's no European response to the refugee crisis, I have to say it's false and true at the same time. It's false insofar as the Commission, working very closely together with the European Parliament, has provided all the necessary elements for a European response, but it's true to the extent that that response will only be effective and show palpable results when all the member states actually move from words to deeds. Some are often hasty in rushing to criticise the Union, and Brussels, as they say, saying we have to look in the mirror. If they look in the mirror, they will see that Brussels means them too. It's the member states and the governments. The call for action from the European Union reflects a lack of tangible commitments to the Union. When the Council convenes, it's up to the member states to redouble their efforts. We need real effective instruments which will allow us to deliver an effective European asylum policy. And I would call once again upon this Parliament to ensure that we can move ahead in the necessary serenity in setting up a European border and coast guard service. If we have a common border, we must manage it together. If we can't understand that, Schengen will not survive. Europe has internal borders. That's a reality that young people today have never experienced. So much the better. We don't want that to change. Internal borders is something which the Erasmus and Internet generation cannot reconcile. And I rather wonder whether the 1.7 million cross-border commuters who cross borders to work every day would be happy to see the end of the Schengen zone, nor would the transport companies want to have to lose money because of the setting up of border checks. 24 million business journeys every year. Millions of cross-border transport operations. All this costs money. The cost of non-Schengen would be very high. It's not a program for growth and jobs. It's a program against growth and jobs. And so we must do everything we can to preserve the Schengen zone in full awareness of the fact that this will entail a European policy to guard our borders effectively. That's why the Commission will shortly be coming forward with its proposals on legal migration and a revision of the Dublin rules governing asylum applicants.
Well, when we're talking about protecting our borders, it is not enough to look at this from our side. We must look at the borders that we share with others. We must look at them also with their eyes. It's not enough to have summits, however important they may be. We have to have determined daily efforts. We're simply not talking about giving up. We are talking about simple daily tasks that entail common registration, daily efforts being made, and we are also working with Turkey. And we've seen some very welcome progress here, so that we can in fact have visum obligations for visa obligations for Syrians. These are very important steps that we have made, but there's still a great deal to do, and the flow of refugees should in the long term be curbed, and we must implement what we have decided, and very quickly.
All the headlines I'm reading day after day. But I have nothing against those headlines when they talk about hard work that produces good results. December's historic agreement on climate change demonstrated the European Union's capacity for global leadership. In Paris, the European Union worked hard for a deal that was ambitious and legally binding, and that is what we have achieved. But the real work starts now. The Commission is assessing the Paris Agreement so that we can move on to agreeing on new steps. In the meantime, the EU member states will have to continue setting the example and implement current commitments so that we meet the collectively agreed 2020 targets. Regarding the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union, the European Council held a constructive debate on the 4 baskets that the British government set out. Let me underline what I said at the time. None of these 4 baskets are simple and easy to address. We are treating each of them seriously. But let me also underline that the Commission, as I said before, wants a fair deal for Britain. The Union is stronger with Britain inside, and Britain is stronger inside the Union. That's why we do think that the deal we are seeking has to be a fair deal for the European Union too. The Commission is working together with the colleagues and representatives of the Council into that direction. I would like, Mr. President, to conclude by paying tribute once more to the work of this Parliament. I am witnessing this Parliament for more than 12 months now, and I have to say that our coordinated action is producing good results. This Parliament has helped the Commission to deliver precisely good results. When we needed speed, when we needed flexibility for our new proposals, the Parliament was there and the Parliament delivered. I am grateful for this support and confident that we will continue in the same spirit for this year and for the next years. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Commissioner President. On behalf of the EPP, I give the floor to Mr. Weber. President, colleagues, when we look back, I think a lot of citizens look with horror. They have seen terrors, economic challenges and so on, and the many crises that we've heard described by Mr. Tusk and Mr. Juncker. But nevertheless, at the beginning of this new year, I would like to look at what we said in the December plenary. That is, we should look at the successes. We should encourage people to think that we can be successful in Europe. We have Federica Mogherini. I was very proud to be a European politician when I heard the representative of EU going through with the Iran deal. That is certainly a success, that we no longer see nuclear weapons being produced there. That is a huge European success, and thank you very much. At the press conference on Friday of the Commission President, we heard the figures for the Juncker plan. Thousands of undertakings in Europe benefit from the billions that we have provided. And Paris is a symbol for the climate, and the combat against climate change is also a success. So therefore it's important that we remember that when we want to convince people of our value. In December, that's my second point, we had the discussion about the Great Britain. David Cameron in the Council put forward the ideas with a very positive slant, and there was a great deal of success there. Many of the ideas that David Cameron put forward are ideas that could help Europe progress if we tackle them together. I would say what he said about competitiveness, innovation, better regulations, big on big things and small things. He had the full support of the EPP group there, and we would like to see this succeed. It's going to be more difficult when we're talking about social abuse or abuse of social services, but at the beginning of this year, the EPP cannot accept when we're talking about discrimination against European citizens, and this is something we must be successful in dealing with. There's something in this debate that in London they're talking about ever closer union. And I do understand the concerns to have powers to Brussels and so on. It's a very critical discussion, but when we see this discussion, I think people should take a close look at the text. Ever closer union of peoples, not of institutions, not of Brussels, not of states.
Und das ist eine perfekte Beschreibung.
And that's a perfect description of the idea of Europe. After the terrible wars we've had on this continent, we should bring people together, ever closer union of peoples. That's why I think that this text should be read in detail in the debate in the UK, because it's actually a very good lecture about what we see after those terrible wars. And then there's the question, the major issue of migration. For us in EPP, we can say if there's a war in Syria and 250,000 people have died, then of course we must help. Closing borders, where we say we can't help, is not something we find acceptable. On the other hand, we know that the figures we see in many areas are challenges. They're too high, and we must get back to sustainable figures in the long term. And on behalf of my group, I'd like to say that we welcome the Commission presenting texts, and we think that, President, we will be able to deal with this text very quickly so that we can see Europe deliver. What now needs to be done is simply to implement rights. And, dear colleagues, from the 1.1 million people that have arrived in my home country, Germany, 1.1 billion people, 40% of these are Syrians only. Therefore, we must make sure that those don't have any reason to leave their home should not be accepted in Europe and are sent back. Secondly, there's another thing we must do. We look at what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve. We must protect people, but it's more very clear that those who break the law and go against the traditions and don't accept the culture between women and women in Europe then are also not accepting the terms of being guests, and therefore they must be sent back. And another thing we must go through with is to help in the countries of origin. And this is an appeal to Council, President. We are financing 3 million euro for Turkey, and the European Parliament must change the change greatly. We are delivering in Europe, and what we see is that Italy is not prepared, or only prepared to have counter activities in order to transfer the money, and then that harms the credibility of Europe. Therefore, I would appeal to you that we must look at this attitude, we must break it out. It harms our credibility, and this loss of credibility is the reason why we see populism in Europe. We shouldn't just make promises, but this lack of credibility is the basis for populism. Let's tackle this in 2016.
Herr Weber, es gibt eine Frage der Frau.
There's a question from Mr. Grapini for you. From Mr. Grapini, please.
Domnule Weber.
Mr. Weber, you might remember that I was asking you in December a similar question. You keep giving us advice and saying grand words here. However, don't you think that what you've just said on the policy on migration and refugees should have been on Mrs. Merkel's mind from the beginning? Now she speaks of conditions for observing our culture and our values, but these conditions have not been in place from the beginning. Do you think she was right?
I think we must all consider how we deal with the immigration issue, and I say clearly, and listen to me, if 250,000 have been killed in Syria through civil war, and 40,000 have left this country because there's war there, because bombs are thrown, then everybody in Europe must live up to its responsibility and say, we are a Christian continent and people who flee these areas must be given help. That's the main point. I think perhaps people in Poland should listen to this very clearly. And Europe, there's a limit to what we can provide. We have figures that we must stick to, that we need to define what we are capable of providing, and we must discuss this at great length. Thank you.
Für die sozialdemokratische Fraktion hat jetzt das Wort.
For the SND, Mr. Guerrero Salon. Thank you very much. The conclusions of the last Council has created a certain amount of disaffection and lack of we can't understand. And it's not because you haven't adopted decisions or because you haven't agreed on certain issues. You have done so on important issues such as immigration, terrorism, monetary union. But the problem is that one looks at the conclusions of June, of October, or of the informal meetings of September and November, one has to look very, very closely in order to realize that we don't have the same conclusions. And thus, once again, we have to follow the same process. The Council prepares and proposes, and then decisions are taken in the Council meetings, and then the Member States, when they go back to their capitals, they simply ignore or they don't execute the particular decisions which have been taken by the Council. This is the myth of Sisyphus, this constant circle going on, and we see it taking place over and over. Terrorism. Still, there has been no resolution with regard to the issue of exchange of information. This morning, Mr. Juncker pointed out that it's as if we're in the year 2001, after the attack on the Twin Towers in New York. Also, the proposal announced by Mr. Juncker this morning in order to fight terrorism, immigration. First of all, we don't have the hotspots up and running, and we don't have the necessary organization, and the moral climate is also, and the enthusiasm is dropping within the European Union as well with regard to the proposals that are being made to the Commission. We need also investment in order to reduce inequality, but that isn't there either. Once again, the myth of Sisyphus, we're condemned once again to going back to the starting point. And Toynbee, whom you just cited, well, if we don't avoid our own suicide, then we definitely will fall into that vicious circle of Sisyphus, and that will be our political death.
Now,
Mr. Van Orden, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, too often the European Union seems more concerned with finding a role for itself, with institutional self-preservation and driving forward political integration. It tries to do too much and ends up doing little or making things worse. In fact, many of the problems, economic, political, security, are consequences of the EU's own policies. We welcome the support of other governments and sensible members of this House for the reforms sought by the British Prime Minister. The opportunity for change should be grasped enthusiastically. MEPs should be the first to recognise that the citizens of our countries do not want ever closer union. They want national governments responsible to them for their actions. They want a European Union that costs less and which spends its resources more effectively. They want an EU that cuts red tape and removes barriers to trade and competitiveness, and which moves rapidly to conclude free trade agreements with countries such as India and our transatlantic partners. They certainly don't want the whole nature of our countries changed by the massive, uncontrolled influx of people from other cultures. And clearly our countries should be able to adjust their benefit systems as necessary and given greater flexibility in the scope and duration of suspending EU rules for public policy or national security reasons. We should recognise how sensible David Cameron's policy towards refugees has been, dealing with the problem at source, helping those in the refugee camps and accepting limited numbers of the most vulnerable. Perhaps the Commission should be looking at ways to reduce the pull factors and reviewing the limitations imposed by international laws, such as the Refugee Convention and ECHR. And as Mr. Weber has said, most refugees don't come from Syria. Terrorism is a separate matter from migration, although not entirely unrelated. We welcome the PNR agreement. This is an important breakthrough, but we still need to go further. Much of the cooperation that people want is best done between our national police and security agencies. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Orden. Now, Now, from the Liberals, Mr. Verhofstadt, please.
First of all, I have to tell you that I hesitated a little bit to participate in this debate because we repeat ourselves time and again. I think it's the fourth or the fifth time that we have exactly the same debate, and I agree with Mr. Guerrero. We used a very accurate comparison, the myth of Sisyphus. Every time we say, yeah, we need the European Border and Coast Guard. Well, it is. It's now months that the Commission has put on the table of the Council that proposal, and still we are waiting for that, while everybody knows that's the first thing to do, to register, to monitor, to secure our external borders. And when I hear then, Mr. Van Orden, that you are praising Mr. Cameron's policy on refugees, well, go, maybe with me or a number of other volunteers, to the camps in Calais and in Dunkirk, where they are living in the mud, pregnant women, children, who are not allowed to come in Britain. Nevertheless, their family are living in Britain, and they are not allowed to come in. That is then the so-called open policy of a conservative government. I can tell you it's a shame when you go there and when you see in what circumstances these people have to live. Because it's easy to talk about the southern borders of Europe if you see what is happening on the western borders of Europe. And my fear is that after all we have no longer Schengen applied in Denmark, in Sweden, in Austria, in Slovenia, in Hungary. What is happening if tomorrow Germany is doing that? That could be the end of Schengen. That could be the end of the European Union. Okay, that's what you want. That's what you want. You want to return to your British Empire that no longer existed. But the reality is a little bit different. The reality is that today this all is falling apart because of a lack of decision by member states. It's not the European Union who has a lack of decision. It's the Council who time and again comes together. I hope every time that they're going to take decisions on European Border and Coast Guard, on the new economic migration policy, on a new asylum system, and on a relocation system, a mandatory relocation system for the refugees. And what is happening? 290 people have been relocated officially of the 160,000 proposed by the European Commission. And everybody knows that even that is theory, because in the reality there are more than 1 million people already inside the European Union and in need of a new system. So my plea to you, Mr. Tusk, is you're going to have an exceptional summit on the 18th, I think, of February on Brexit. Well, I propose a change. Do an exceptional summit on the refugee crisis. The kind of Brexit can wait until March of April. I think that the most urgent thing to tackle now is that finally to take decisions with the member states on every of the 4 points that is necessary. A relocation system, a migration system, a new asylum system, and at the same time, the first to do a European Border and Coast Guard. And that seems to me far more important than now to start the whole discussion about the Brexit, because it could be that you find maybe a way out for the Brexit, that Britain remains in the European Union, but it could be that we find ourselves without a European Union if we continue like that.
So, Herr Verhofstadt, Sie haben jetzt die freie Auswahl.
Now you have a choice, Mr. Verhofstadt, of a whole range of questions that people want to ask you. Actually, the entire UKIP group has things that they want to ask you, but we'll have to follow some sort of form of order. Mr. Batten was the first that wanted to pose a question. Mr. Batten, please.
Mr. Verhofstadt, you and I come from completely different points of view, but I always enjoy listening to you and I always respect what you say, because in what you say there is a very clear, honest and logical policy. It just happens to be totally different from what I believe in. You actually do believe in closer integration politically and economically. You know what the real meaning of ever closer union of the peoples of Europe means, and I respect that. The people I don't respect are the people on my own side who don't pretend to know what it means or that it isn't happening. May I ask you a question and extend you an invitation? When we have our referendum in Britain, will you please come and argue for the stay inside so that we can have an absolutely honest and clear debate?
Okay. Bitte, Herr Verhofstadt.
Yes, please, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Well, I accept the invitation. I think that the first who is laughing then is Mr. Farage. He likes that, such a thing, that to have a debate about it. But you have a little bit to go further into your reasoning. How should be the state of the British economy without the internal market in the European continent? What should be the weight of the City of London if they cannot longer trade in euros when 70 or 80% of all the trading in the City of London is done in euros? I think that Britain has to remain in Europe, and it's completely crazy to think that you can go back in history and to do it on your own. That is not working in the globalized world of tomorrow.
Thank you. Now, for the United Left, colleague ZUBER.
At the heart of the Council's response to the refugee crisis is basically to strengthen expulsion mechanisms. The pretext being the increasing number of refugees. The European Union is rejecting anyone who's not an applicant for asylum. References have been made to the hotspots, which would be centres that allow you to expel refugees from Europe faster. They want to identify them and support countries such as Italy and Greece in so-called return operations, which basically mean expulsion operations. 3 billion for Turkey in exchange for keeping refugees in their territory. Goodness knows what conditions will apply to their dignity and rights there. The problem is that Europe has created a situation which is continuing to perpetuate by interfering in the Middle East and North Africa. What the Council should have decided was to provide Frontex and Europol with funds for internal security. We should be turning resources to welcome people. There's virtually no reference to that in the conclusions. They need to create legal, safe routes. That would extend a worthy humanitarian solution. Thank you.
Thank you. For the Greens, Madam Lunacek, please.
Thank you, Presidents, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen in the gallery. In December, at least at the summit, we heard some self-criticism of governments that the situation of the refugees does not work, and that is a first step towards improvements. But what we see today, a month later, this crisis management in the refugee issues has still not become functional, and that's disastrous. The so-called hotspots are not working at all. The distribution of asylum seekers is not working. 60,000 had been foreseen. We're talking about 190 so far. That doesn't help at all. People should be able to believe that we in the Union can find solutions. And Mr. Tusk, I agree with Mr. Verhofstadt. What we need to see at the last summit is in fact a summit where Council members say that we stand together as Europe. We're not Brussels Europe. We are all the governments here, and only together can we find a solution, because what will happen otherwise is that the Schengen borders will be reintroduced. That is disastrous. It's going to fail. and national states will then see a step backwards promoted by themselves. And now I criticize Austria and the federal government. They're saying that there's a very cynical game we're playing with the refugees. The more pressure there is on the borders and on Greece, the more we will find a European solution. That's cynical. We need to find European solutions, and that should be taken at the next summit, Mr. Tusk. Brexit can wait.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Farage, on behalf of the EFDD.
I'm looking forward to Guy Verhofstadt, the Liberal Group leader, coming to the United Kingdom to take part in the Brexit debate. Your passionate defence of a United States of Europe and a European army is, I know, sincerely held, and I'm sure the Liberal Democrats will be delighted. It's now been a month. It's now been a month since the last European summit.
Okay.
And you know, I don't know about week being a long time in politics. There's been a sea change in that month, and I think that one event has woken people up to the folly of EU leaders, the Juncker Common Asylum Plan, the Merkel call, which led to a stampede. Those of us that have warned that unlimited numbers of people from different cultures without security checks would pose a threat to the cohesion of our societies were roundly abused for doing so. And then we came to New Year's Eve. Munich. The train station, the main station, closed down because of a terrorist threat, the intelligence coming from Syria and Iraq. The very same train station that in September people had stood at, holding up their placards, "Refugees welcome." That irony was not lost on me. But it's what happened, I think, in Cologne, where we saw the mob. Up to 1,000 young males in the street sexually assaulting and harassing women. It is, I think, in many ways one of the most disgraceful public order events that we've seen in modern-day Europe. And yet there was an attempt by the police and the press to cover it all up, and even the suggestion from some German politicians that German young women should change their dress and their mode of behaviour in the street, which I thought was a total insult. There's even a name for these assaults. A name for these assaults in Egypt, because they've now become commonplace and part of everyday life. And we ought to have the courage to send out a message to say these assaults must never be acceptable in any European town or city, and we'll do our damnedest to make sure that it never happens again. Now we go to the next European summit, and Mr Cameron's going to conclude his renegotiation. I've no doubt there'll be a compromise on the fairly minor issue of migrant benefits. I've no doubt that he will come back from that summit with a few promissory notes for the future about Britain's relationship. But what he's not going to be talking about is our ability to get back control of our borders. And the British people know that those young men in Cologne, in a few years' time, will have EU passports and be free to come to Britain. And just to give you an idea of how big the sea change has been, a Daily Telegraph commentator, Alison Pearson, who had said she was undecided on Brexit, she didn't have enough information, wrote this the other day. She said, after Cologne, the EU referendum is about nothing less than the safety and security of British women. We, the Euro clueless, need to woman up and vote for the right of our daughters and granddaughters to live as they choose and to smile in the street. No more Mrs. Don't Know, let's get the hell out. I hope 2016 is our year of deliverance.
Ich muss zunächst
Now,
Folgendes bitten. Wir hatten Frau Lunacek eben.
now there was a blue card for Madam Lunacek, which I overlooked. So we'll go a step back, and then Mr. Verhofstadt wanted to respond to Mr. Farage, so we're taking a step back.
His party, UKIP, has a whole record, so he should maybe take another language in this.
Okay. So,
President, is this reasonable behaviour? We've had it more than once from this gentleman. Surely we should all be equal in this chamber and treated fairly and with decency and courtesy and respect.
Sie hatten mir noch nicht die Gelegenheit gegeben.
You didn't give me the opportunity, Mr. Farage, to respond. You took the floor on your own in this particular instance. Now, Mr. Verhofstadt, the reason for the particular point that you made, if you cannot substantiate it, then if you cannot substantiate that, then we'll have to move forward now to Madame von STORCH. And the question now was for Madame Lunacek.
Das ist richtig. Frau Lunacek, nur eine...
Mr. Schulz, that's true. Mrs. Lunacek, between Austria and Germany, I have a question. When do you think it is justified for Germany to protect its borders with a certain number of refugees in mind? Can you give us millions, a figure in round millions?
Frau von Storch, Sie wissen ganz genau, dass diese...
You know perfectly well, madam, that these kind of figures don't work. What would you do if you, which I hope is not the case, you said Germany will accept 1 million and 1,000,001 will simply be asked to do something about? It doesn't happen.
Das Wort hat jetzt im Namen der ENF-Fraktion Frau...
Now the floor goes to Madame Maya from the ENF.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you, President. The conclusions of the European Council last year are similar to those of dozens of previous councils, where symbolic decisions are put down on paper, but the only solution to stopping this asylum invasion, namely closing the borders, is something that the European elite is still not willing to address. And you can see that in news in recent weeks. More than 31,000 refugees, asylum seekers have crossed the border, much more than last year. And then there were the mass attacks by asylum seekers in Cologne, Stuttgart and elsewhere. And there's been a terrorist attack in Istanbul from a so-called refugee wanting to get to Europe. And there was an attempt to stone two transsexuals in Dortmund, perpetrated by Stuttgart. Now, in Brussels, what you want is more refugees, more terrorists, and forgetting all the victims of attack and rape. My country wants to protect the Netherlands by closing our borders. We have to preserve what we've built up: freedom, security, and prosperity. We can't allow that to be destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now to Mr. Zarianopoulos. So there seems to be one line which goes through the Council. EMU, making it more profound, working in favor of capital and cutting salaries and social benefits and unifying markets. All of this goes hand in hand with the imperialistic approach, wars and the anti-terrorist movements that have been initiated, once again in an imperialist spirit, but unemployment, poverty and refugees on the other hand. The Council has taken measures to adopt the particular proposal with regard to hotspots, which will be totally ineffective because the majority of individuals will simply drown in the Aegean Sea. So the establishment, furthermore, of a border guard without the consent of member state goes contrary to the rights of sovereignty of Greece and puts the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey under NATO control, essentially. Only the struggle of peoples, of workers, can rectify the situation at this point.
Habe ich Sie richtig verstanden, dass Sie sich zur Geschäftsordnung melden wollen, Herr Verhofstadt?
Mr. Verhofstadt, with regard to an issue in order?
And I answer to you that if you go to Google and you Google UKIP and harassment, you have the answer to the question that you have put to me. Okay?
Wir sehen das. Okay, vielen Dank für den Hinweis.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor on behalf of the EPP to Mr. Lamassoure.
Thank you, President. Let's be candid about this. We've all failed vis-à-vis migration. First of all, the member states, the larger states and the smaller ones, the more open and the closed ones, the countries outside the Schengen zone just as much as Schengen members, the European Union itself, with its programme for relocating refugees only covering 10% of the total number of real entries. As was pointed out just now, it's only about 1 or 2 per thousand. Now, the lesson we can draw from this is clear. National egoism just doesn't work. It's no longer an option. A member state cannot, at one and the same time, put the problem onto the shoulders of its neighbours and then turn around to them and call for European money for public investment. A member state can't take decisions off its own bat to welcome anyone who turns up at its door and then call on its partners for help if they've taken a different policy choice. Which of our member states can hope on its own to tackle the problem in a country of origin, be it in peace or at war, or a country of transit such as Turkey or Libya? As for the European Council, turning to the President of the Council, how can it claim to be the sovereign decision-taking body of the members of the European Union while allowing the member states to go back home and boast publicly about the fact that they're not going to implement its own decisions? What have we come to? We are divided and we are becoming passive subjects of events within and without. It's only together that we can tackle the problems. There's a time for emotion, but there's a time for reason too, and there's a time to return to what should be the top quality of those holding responsibilities such as ourselves, responsibility.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Fajon for 2 minutes.
Hvala, spoštovani. Evropska unija že leta drvi iz krize v krizo, gasimo eno prid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We have jumped from one crisis into another, and after the December Council, I'm not sure we can be that optimistic about migrants, because we've got problems everywhere. We have problems with return, with accommodation, with cooperation with Turkey, amongst other things. I've called on government leaders to ensure that we do not get new walls put up where old ones have come down, and this simply leads to further intolerance. People are concerned. They're worried about European solidarity. They're worried that this solidarity is not being expressed, and we are very concerned about what is now going to happen this spring, with many refugees trying to get into Europe. 3 days ago, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union, 3 years ago, the European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize. Now this ought to motivate us. It ought to motivate us to join together and do what is necessary. It's a fact that it isn't possible for a state on its own to face up to this challenge, and this is why we have to do what is necessary. We have to act together. We shouldn't be egotistical and nationalistic in this approach. Perhaps we should talk a little less, agree a little more, and do a lot more. We find ourselves in a very difficult situation, and it is simply a scandal that for weeks in this institution we keep trotting out the same thing and nothing happens. It could be political suicide, indeed. If we do nothing, then there won't be a European Union left.
Thank you. Ms. Fotiga has 1 minute. Thank you. The Council needs to work out the link between the terrorist threat and the inflow of refugees. We have seen some shocking examples of this link recently. The United Kingdom is interested in the relationship between the institutions and the member states.
Madame González Peñas, pour 1 minute également.
Mrs. González Peñas for 1 minute as well.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. This week brings to the end a European semester which has seen harsh blows inflicted on Greece. They have had to do everything they could to try to retrieve some of their sovereignty. And we have in Europe been responsible for creating greater skepticism. We've been deliberating on TTIP, on the welfare state, and we have not defended social rights and human rights properly. We have greater and greater inequality, which you simply don't address. There is really a Europe of two speeds. There's one in the north, there's one in the south, which has fewer and fewer social rights and is poorer every day. There is no moral authority for a Commission President who vests greater interest and attention in multinationals than in the countries of the European Union. It can't be said that this is a Commission that is responding to the needs of a humanitarian crisis and refugees and asylum seekers.
Ferrara, pour 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Ferrara. 2 minutes.
Divisioni e diffidenze continuano.
Thank you very much. Divisions and lack of certainty continue in this European Union as we face many challenges. President Juncker has talked to us about a number of crises today, numerous crises. It is all very easy to criticize Brussels, but many governments and many citizens should be looking them in the mirror and recognizing the error of their own ways. The press in Italy is ready to criticize Mr. Renzi, who is apparently an inadequate interlocutor for Brussels, but this is no news to the Cinque Stelle group, because we have for a long time been saying that there is no credibility any longer in this government. It wasn't even elected by the citizens, and therefore it can't represent society either nationally nor at European level. So we are amazed that it's taken the European Commission so long to see the defects in Italy. But you, President Juncker, and our Prime Minister Renzi ought to be concerned about the lack of dialogue and the lack of engagement with our citizens, who are absolutely fed up. They're fed up of policies which are doing them more harm than good. There is a clear crisis of representation here. There are many divisions. There's a huge amount of lack of understanding. There are meetings, there are discussions in institutions which take place behind closed doors. This is the case for the European Council, for example. There are no recordings. We don't know what was discussed. We don't know what the positions of the various member states were. So in the face of all this, which is very detrimental to democracy, to direct democracy, which is what we're supposed to have, citizens can't understand what is happening, how it's happening, what the situation really is. And they can't understand what the vested interests at stake, which are so greatly protected, actually are. So please, President Juncker and President Tusk, explain to us how things are. We would like to know the reality. We would like to know the truth, please.
Merci, Madame Bizzotto.
Thank you. Ms. Bizzotto has 1 minute.
Colleagues, I'm extremely confused and I'm exceptionally concerned. Only a few months ago, we were being told here that immigration was a huge opportunity for the continent of Europe. Now, all of a sudden, rather timidly, we're beginning to be told that perhaps it's a problem. And the problem of migration is bringing us to our knees. Only a few months ago, 1 million immigrants came into Europe, and the flows of migrants continue to come in. With your crazy decisions, you've caused chaos in Europe. Look at our cities. They're invaded by thousands of illegal immigrants who are simply taking advantage of our welcoming approach. They're robbing, they're destroying, they're attacking. Look at what happened in Cologne. This is proof that the European Union has failed to control immigration. The problem is just getting worse. So what do? Close the frontiers. Do you want to help the citizens in Europe? Do you want to use the resources that the European Union has to help the citizens rather than these fake refugees? Do you actually want to do anything about the cities in the European Union? Do you want to stop these illegal immigrants coming from these countries? There is nothing but blah, 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 and lots of useless rules.
1 minute.
Mr. SYNADINOS has 1 minute.
Madam President, when the Commission President announces great plans to deal with immigration, what we realise is that we need to change the Commissioner and we need to change the Council. Otherwise we're going to see more people dying, and €3 billion have been promised to Turkey, and this is simply going to feed the coffers of Islamic State. So we've got to wonder where the relocation and resettlement plan has actually got to. Now there's going to be a Coast Guard and Border Guard force created for Europe, but we have to sit here and listen to all these stupidities. How much time is going to pass and how much money is going to be spent, and what is going to be the necessary underpinning for what you're planning? Where will the money come from? What about subsidiarity? What about proportionality in all of this? Borders belong to member states. Now in Italy they're thinking about having European maritime forces, and the same thing in the Aegean, I understand.
Mr. González Pons has 1 minute 30.
Thank you very much. We're embarking on a difficult year for the European Union. As we knew right from the outset, the old problems are still with us, and as Enrique Guerrero said, and there are others that are manifesting themselves in a different way, as the attack on women in Central Europe or the increase in xenophobia. But there are new procedures as well for protecting the rule of law, such as the Commission has embarked on recently. And President Tusk, I think, can give us a clear opinion on this, although we have heard about it through the Commission statement. I am no soothsayer, but I think that migration is going to continue this coming year because the war continues. The winter is with us. The flows of refugees will not abate, and we are not applying a common policy on refugees. I'm not a soothsayer, yet I'm sure we will continue to be debating terrorism because it is a huge and imminent threat, and because we're not sharing information and data, because in the last few months there have been very serious attacks. There have been 9 German citizens killed in Turkey very recently. I'm not a soothsayer, but I know we're going to be talking about the economy, about a single market, about employment, about a fiscal and monetary union. We're going to be talking about China. I'm no soothsayer, but I do know that we need to be talking about the UK. We must do this because Europe without the United Kingdom will be much the poorer. And the United Kingdom without Europe, in my opinion, will also be much the poorer. I think it's time we made it quite clear to them, better together, as they said to the Scots.
Mr. Rubik has a blue card question for you, Mr. González. Would you take it? Mr. Rubik has a blue card question. Will you accept it, Mr. González? Thank you very much. I think it is vital to work out what the strategy is in the refugee crisis for Spain and for Greece. I don't think we need a one-size-fits-all solution. Could you possibly flesh that out a bit more? We need to be sure international law is respected.
Es muy importante que la Comisión
It's very important for the Commission to do its work on refugees, and it's doing so. It's very important that the Council takes seriously the needs of the European citizens, and I think it is aware of this, but it's very important that the Member States apply and implement what the European Commission decides, and this is what it's not doing.
Next we'll hear for 1.5 minutes from Ms. Rodriguez.
Yes, Mr. President, we are dealing with overlapping crises, but I do believe that we should clearly identify which are the central problems which must be tackled if you want to keep European Union, if you want to keep the Union of Europeans. And I believe that the 2 central problems are managing the refugees crisis and second, bringing down unemployment in Europe. And I believe that we need to tackle these 2 problems together. That's why I would like to propose that 3 big investment initiatives should be launched, which can create a lot of new jobs, particularly for young people, dealing with 3 main objectives. One would be to build up a real European border. The second is to adapt our societies to integrate refugees. And the third is to cooperate with origin countries in order to manage the refugees' flow. So to build up a real European border, this is a big undertaking. We know this is about physical infrastructures, logistics, software, stuff. Adapting our cities and towns, this is also a big investment initiative, because this means housing, education, urban planning. And third, in cooperation, you can bring many young people to participate in such an action. So this is the kind of proposal we should come up.
Merci.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Albiol Guzman has 1 minute.
Gracias. Hoy en este pleno el
Thank you very much, President. The President of the Commission and the Commissioner for Immigration and President Tusk should be resigning because they have failed to manage the refugees crisis completely, because the European Union agreed to relocate 165,000 people, that they've barely managed to relocate a few hundred. Many people have drowned in the Mediterranean, and thousands of people are barely eking out an existence or surviving in camps, in refugee camps, of which we should be ashamed. It's a complete lack of solidarity. It's an atrocity. It's absolutely cruel. 3,000 million euros for Turkey, on the other hand, so that it does our dirty work. That's what has been on offer, to stop refugees coming to Europe, because that's where solidarity is operating. This is where there's supposed to be a systematic attempt to keep the refugees out. So the funds are going to Turkey, 3 times as much for Turkey to do our dirty work as there is for the European Union to help the refugees.
Mr. Lundgren, 1 minute.
Thank you very much for the floor. A year full of failures lies behind the EU, and a new year full of possibilities for further failures now lies ahead of us in terms of EU cooperation. We've seen that there's been a mass immigration of almost biblical quantity, and as a consequence of that we see new terrorist attacks taking place. These are of a dimension that we've not seen before in Europe. EU is being questioned, and my country, people are now asking whether we should be paying the full membership fee. And Mr. Juncker and Mr. Tusk, on their salaries, I wonder what your monthly salary is. 38,000 euros retroactively paid out since July last year. I wonder how you could imagine in your wildest imagination that you represent the people of Europe.
Merci. La parole est à Madame Atkinson.
Thank you. Mrs. Atkinson has 1 minute.
In December, the rapes, the sexual assaults and the sexual harassment of women was off the agenda. And at the Germans' request, it's off the agenda this week too. In towns across Europe, all liberal, tolerant societies are turning against the mass influx of migrants. In Germany, transgender women are stoned. In Sweden, schoolgirls are sexually assaulted at a music event. In Austria, girls assaulted at school. And barbarians are sending their migrants on buses to Mrs. Merkel, who then sends them back again. That's unfair to genuine asylum seekers. German colleagues, Angela Merkel welcomed 800,000. Now you have 1.2 million. You give them passports. They bring their families. That's potentially 10 million extra. Then they can take those passports and their families and move to the UK. That's the size of my constituency in the southeast and the Czech Republic. So how do we deal with this? We build more camps. We house them in the Middle East, in North Africa, and we support them, and eventually they may go back, because this is a clash of civilizations. And when that happens,
Merci,
we
Madame.
know where that can lead.
Mr. Kefalogiannis has 1.5 minutes.
Οι προσφυγικές και μεταναστευτικές ροές συνεχίζουν.
Thank you, Madam President. We are seeing refugees and migrants coming in at a continuing rate, with roughly 2 migrants for every refugee. People are being transported from Morocco, from the Maghreb to the European Union. people are able to move freely, including those traveling illegally. Dozens of people have died in the Aegean in the first weeks of this year. We need to see an end to the war in Syria so that people can return home to safety. We can't just simply carve them up among the states of the European Union. We need to bolster the external border of the EU. 2 minutes, Mr. Fleckenstein, please.
Madam President, colleagues, the air is getting thinner. Back home in Germany too, the air is getting thinner because people are beginning to notice that we don't really have things under control. And by we, it's Brussels they tend to mean rather than the capitals. And it's our damn duty to prove that we have got things under control. Meanwhile, German ministers are in open opposition to the German Chancellor. Mrs. Regner was saying this. She was saying we need to close the borders, or at least have a plan to do so. But we all know that by closing borders, we are not going to be solving any problem. We're not solving a problem at all. We're simply creating new problems. If we really want to convince people, then we're going to have to offer more at home than I can after this debate, because when I go home and say that Mr. Tusk spoke and said all major crises have been discussed, we had a constructive discussion with Mr. Cameron, we have to intensify efforts to consolidate the internal market, we discussed the energy union. No, they are going to want to know what is actually happening. And I think, therefore, that in this debate we should now stop. We don't need any further reports from Council if it's just a matter of reporting we discussed it. No, we want to see the outcomes. Maybe, President Tusk, it's rather like the Pope. Get yourself in a conclave and only emerge when you've got real results and the white smoke comes out of the chimney, when you've actually got some results. But just to get together every couple of months in order to reciprocally exchange on the fact that we have problems is not a council. One final sentence to you personally. I would like to thank you for the way in which you have tackled a very serious issue, and we need a discussion on democracy, and I think you played a good role in that yesterday. The constant interruptions by the President, who was asking him to complete.
Mr. Fleckenstein, listen to me, please. There's a blue card question for you. Well, I'm sure you agree, Mr. Ujazdowski. Madam President, Mr. Fleckenstein, you were calling into question the investment in strengthening the external border. I'm afraid if we don't defend our external border, what else can we do? What do you have to suggest? You have plenty of words of criticism for others, but what do the socialists think we should actually do about this problem?
The socialist answer is the one that we gave this House. We need to protect the external borders, or control the external borders, because it is only in that way we would have a possibility to avoid destroying Schengen. That is the job that the heads of state and government must now agree amongst each other. They need to really get down to work on that, and if there are those that don't wish to participate, they have to work out whether they really wish to stay in Schengen, because if we don't do this, rather, we will no longer have a Schengen to use.
Madame Wilmot, 1 minute 30.
Ms. Wilmot, 1.5 minutes.
President, it's 1.5 minutes, I'm told. To be honest, my heart sinks that once again here we are discussing a problem of David Cameron's making, rather than the real challenges facing the EU. And I'm sure the EU leaders at the December Council felt the same. But it's important that a deal is done. That's not because I'm backing Cameron's negotiations. His priorities are not my priorities. For example, where are the proposals to end loopholes in working rights legislation that are used by exploitative employers to undercut terms and conditions? We can take heart that some of the more damaging proposals originally floated are no longer on the table. Anti-Europeans on the right were pushing for an attack on EU legislation on working rights, a move that would have undermined the direct benefits that working people see from our EU membership. That these subjects are no longer under discussion will help us to make the case for Britain's continuing membership of the EU, because this referendum is going to be about working people, the part-time checkout assistant who gets equal rights because we're in the EU, the factory worker for whom health and safety isn't red tape but a matter of life and death, the workers in companies large and small whose businesses depend directly or indirectly on trade with Europe. For all these people, for all working people, there are no circumstances under which they would be better off outside the EU. And that's why we need to see a deal done, and a deal done soon, because only then can we get on with the British referendum and put an end to the uncertainty that's bad for Britain and bad for Europe.
C'était bien 1 minute 30, Madame Wilmot. Madame.
1 minute for Ms. Toia.
Thank you. These crises in Europe threaten us with disintegration, and we are well aware of that, and that is why, President Juncker, we want to do our absolute utmost to reverse the trend. We want to save Europe. We want to save the Europe we have, and we want to build a better Europe for the future. The Italians and our government want proper answers from Europe, though. We want what you say to be what you do, and this on immigration, on flexibility, on employment development and so forth. We want more solidarity, we want a more progressive Europe. We are Europeans, we're Europeanists, and we're ambitious. We won the elections on a promise of relaunching a Europe for the future, on greater dynamism, and we want to have these promises delivered. However, sometimes you need to touch the bottom before you can start to climb your way back up to the top. And I think it's not true that we're doing everything wrong. Mr. Weber was talking earlier about the credibility of Europe. Well, yes, it's at risk. Just 30 seconds more, please. It is at risk because Mr. Weber and his friends have imposed ideological austerity, which has brought citizens to their knees and simply exacerbated existing divisions. We want a social agenda and we want employment.
Merci, Madame Toia.
Thank you. 1 minute now for Ms. Garcia Perez.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, President. President Tusk said in his statement that Europe was stronger than we thought. Now, let me say this to you. This is true, but the trouble is, the real problem is the lack of credibility, as you yourself implied, because here we are defending the European project, and it is very difficult for us to justify what is humanly not to be justified. Because just because we don't see the refugees on the front pages of the newspapers anymore doesn't mean the shameful reality is not still there on the ground. What are the national governments waiting for? Why are they not resettling these thousands of refugees who are living in extreme temperatures, in suffering in these camps? Has anyone actually been to see them put themselves in this position, thought that it could be our children who are in these woefully inadequate and awful refugees camps, freezing? I feel absolutely embarrassed. I feel ashamed because there are so many problems. There are potential solutions. They are absolutely urgent. They are truly vital, and we're not delivering them.
1 minute.
1 minute now from Ms. Iotova.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank you, Mr. Juncker, for all the efforts the Commission has been made to find a solution to the refugee crisis. However, I have to draw your attention to something peculiar about the most recent Council conclusions. Notice the use of the future tense. This is not bizarre from a grammatical point of view only. It actually proves that the Council has achieved little. Do you know, Mr. Tusk, that the loudest voices now are those that call for closing our borders? Some member states go as far as opposing the idea of having a new agency for strengthening border protection, and actually this agency is covering only the Schengen area, not all external borders. Why is this so? We have asked, but we have received no answer. There is no information on our cooperation with Turkey. Actually, all facts seem to suggest little has been achieved there. And there are so many unknowns in the so-called voluntary resettlement by Turkey of Syrian citizens residing in Europe. The question of readmission is still open.
Mrs. Ferreira, 1 minute.
Há 19 dias, a resolução de bancos na zona euro passou a ser feita a nível europeu com um método completamente novo, o método do bail-in.
Thank you. For banking resolution, a new method was used, bail-in. Council failed in 2015. There was supposed to be a joint stability mechanism that was going to fund the Common Resolution Fund. That was supposed to be ready before it came into effect, and it was supposed to be agreed with the European Parliament. It was in the agreement of the 5 presidents. There was another promise in 2012 by Mr. Van Rompuy. The single resolution mechanism was supposed to be accompanied by a single deposit guarantee scheme. There is a problem of trust between the European institutions owing to this implementation failure, and I hope in 2016 Council will deliver on its promises. Catch the Eye is next, starting with Ms. Skiraki. 1 minute.
Madam President, Mr. Juncker, there are 2 key terms in this, one of the most urgent crises we've experienced. First of all, the call for commitments from the member states, and secondly, agreements with third countries. Now, with regard to the first of those, I think the time has come for you to think about how we can put together a sanctions mechanism in case some of the agreements reached are not implemented in member states. I think there have been imbalances here in solving the migration problem. This is the key here. It's often the weakest who have been affected by the crisis, and they've had to carry the same burden as the strongest. When it comes to agreements entered into with third countries, Turkey is going to have to do a lot more. Over the last fortnight in Greece, 30,000 people have arrived from Turkey, a few of them refugees, illegal migrants. They're not being returned. We need a mechanism.
Your time is up, madam. Mr. Szanyi.
Tibor.
Mr. Szanyi, Tibor.
Nagyon szépen köszönöm a lehetőséget, elnök asszony. Végighallgatva ezt a...
Thank you very much, Madam President. Listening to this debate, I have to wonder what we're doing in the European Parliament. It isn't right, in my view, for us here in the European Parliament to call somebody to account for failings by the member states. What Chancellor Merkel has done was welcomed by many, but I'm not sure even the Chancellor of Germany is entitled to invite 1 million people to Europe. And then there are countries building fences. And what about the Balkan countries? What are we going to do about those? Those are the real issues that we have to deal with. And Council and Commission finally have to do something. Thank you.
The European Council has a firm stance on returning controls on the external borders. I welcome this. It is clear that a bad migration policy held by the EU and certain EU leaders has actually created problems which we'll have to face not only in the coming months but over the next decade. We have to come to grips with the situation and realize that given the inflow of refugees towards Europe, member states cannot implement rules which were created for different circumstances. The asylum policy was introduced so that as an advanced civilization we can afford protection to groups and individuals which are endangered in their home countries. We cannot do this for entire nations. If we continue to receive migrants in these numbers, we will deepen social and economic problems throughout Europe. Under such circumstances, many rules will not be able to be implemented, and the positive effects will be detrimental to the process of European integration.
I'm not sure where Sebastian is, so the next speaker is Mr. Tiberios.
Το μεταναστευτικό είναι ένα ακόμη σοβαρό θέμα το οποίο δυστυχώς η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση αντιμετώπισε με εσφαλμένο.
Thank you. Sadly, the European Union is doing the wrong thing in the context of this crisis. It has allowed it to get out of hand, and now it has not got the courage of its convictions, and it simply won't try to take control. Colleagues have been talking about the Schengen arrangements, but actually the problem is how we're going to stop these flows of migrants coming through Turkey into the European Union. That's where we need to address the issue. Hotspots, yes, fine, but we can't allow millions of people to be coming into Greece. If there is one country where really and truly the focus should be, it is Turkey. Many migrants, legal and illegal migrants, are coming from there. We know that the authorities don't have any respect for the decisions that have been made. We need to do what we can to protect our external borders.
President of Council, President of the Commission, I welcome the joint border protection initiative as put forward in December 2015. But I am disappointed to hear that there is to be a 7-month delay to June 2016. Here in the debate we have heard most members support this initiative, calling for it to be implemented quickly. That is your responsibility, it's within your remit, and you have the backing of a large chunk of this House. Why not get on with this at the next Council meeting? Why not have an extraordinary Council meeting in February so as to get border protection sorted as soon as possible?
Catch the eye.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of Catch the Eye, and it's Mr. Juncker's turn again, President of the Commission.
Madame la Présidente, mes très chers collègues.
President, colleagues. I have every understanding for those who tire of the same responses day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. President Tusk has left no stone unturned, but the member states have simply failed to implement the decisions that should have been implemented. Therefore, they are in breach, not all, but some, a considerable number. Therefore, there is nothing abnormal nor out of order in us constantly repeating the same answers and reiterating the same pleas and appeals to you. Secondly, I have elicited from a number of comments and remarks here today that some of you feel that the Commission is not active enough in what it is doing. I frankly would not concur with that. I would simply remind you that I outlined to you what the Commission's priorities are, and we are therefore concentrating on policies seeking to stimulate growth and employment. In November 2014, we launched our investment programme of 315 billion euros. Now, it will not have escaped your notice, I'm sure, that 40 billion out of this 315 investment plan have already been mobilised, and 47 major infrastructural projects have been embarked on, 11 in Italy, and many affecting small and medium-sized enterprises. I'm sure it's not escaped your notice either that the Commission has embarked on its security agenda, its energy agenda, and many more initiatives. All these initiatives are absolutely essential, many also for the digital single market. I need not reiterate to you how important we think that is. Therefore, I think it is unfair to suggest that the Commission has not been extremely active in the first year of its mandate. To move on now to some of the problems which were mentioned during the course of the debate, I would have to say that I probably will not take up the friendly invitation to tender my resignation, because I think it would be wrong of me not to focus my efforts on trying to do what I can to resolve the refugee crisis. I should not be packing my bags, I should not be folding my arms, nor standing idly by and failing in my duty. Therefore, I will not be tendering my resignation, and I have nothing further to say at this juncture. Thank you, President. Thank you very much. Mr. Tusk has the floor to wind up the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very briefly, first of all, you are absolutely right. Today we have a problem with implementation. And when it comes to migration crisis, I have no doubts that today we have a really critical moment when it comes to not only implementation of our decisions, but in fact this is maybe the first moment when I feel that this is a critical moment when it comes to political system in Europe. The EU is based on an assumption that all of us, I mean both member states, are ready to act with goodwill, and especially that they are ready to respect our common decisions. Without this method, without this determination, our work doesn't make sense. You are absolutely right. The most critical moment today is that, in fact, I have no problems with achieving compromises on our level, I mean on the level of the European Council. It's quite the opposite. It's too easy to achieve compromise because the day after, almost no one is ready to respect our common decisions. And this is, I think, this is really a critical moment for, not only because of the very migration matter, but for Europe as a political organization. You know, today it's really difficult to discipline member states. Neither I do have thanks nor does the Commission. You know, it's sorry for this brutal joke, but in fact, if this rule, this first principle that we are ready to respect each other and our decisions is not implemented as a first step, in fact, we have a huge problem with implementation anything during our work. So this is the truth. Maybe because the challenge is so unprecedented and really huge, really massive. This is also the very brutal truth. Europe as an organization, but also member states, we didn't prepare enough to face this completely new, when it comes to size, when it comes to numbers, problems with new migration. This is true. I can't agree with your assessment when it comes to our discussion about external borders. Sorry, but in fact, the discussion about external borders, I mean this idea of strengthening our external borders, is quite fresh. If you remember well, I remember very well, the beginning of our discussion about migration crisis, something else was the topical issue, not the external borders. And I'm really satisfied by what the Commission has done when it comes to strengthening external borders and the new idea, quite new idea, about common external border guard in Europe. And as you know, it's still some elements of this idea are still controversial for some member states, for many reasons, and it's still a quite demanding challenge to explain and to convince them that we need this new and controversial but absolutely, I think, necessary new measure. In fact, what we need, I think, today, we have to solve some problems as quickly as possible. This is why my intention is to dedicate the February European Council meeting to the UK issue, and I hope it will be our last European Council meeting about this issue. But of course, the February meeting will be devoted also to assessment of implementation when it comes to migration crisis. Also Turkey, our action plan with Turkey. And of course the next European Council in March will be also dedicated, not only, but will be also dedicated to migration, to the migration crisis. Esteban has asked about Poland. As I said a few days ago here in the European Parliament, at the meeting with political groups, the EU has a right and an obligation to engage in a tough and open dialogue with the authorities of every EU member state where the rule of law and norms of democracy may be violated. But please don't expect me to be happy and full of enthusiasm when the procedure on Poland is launched. I'm absolutely sure, and I know, but I need your understanding also that this is something really difficult for me. And I know that the Commission acted in good faith. I have no doubt. Of course, we can discuss about some measures, some methods, and the decisions of the Commission could have been tougher or softer. There was also discussion inside the Commission about timing, about some procedural nuances. But they took the decision. I mean, the Commission took the decision. I am absolutely sure that this decision is an optimal decision, and I fully support it, without any doubt. And believe me, seeking some conflicts or rift between institutions, especially in this case, it's without any sense. And I am absolutely sure that we will continue as our cooperation also in this, when it comes to Poland, very close. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Ratspräsident, meine Damen und Herren.
Thank you very much indeed, President Tusk. We shall now have a short adjournment.
Als nächster Punkt der Tagesordnung.
The next item on the agenda is a statement from the Commission and Council on the situation in Poland. Colleagues, could I refer you to the fact that in this particular debate there will be no catch-the-eye procedure, nor will there be any blue cards permitted.
Sehr geehrte, wir lassen jetzt hier keine Geschäftsordnungsdebatte zu.
Colleagues, we are now going to begin the debate. We're not going to get engaged in a debate on points of order. This is what was agreed in the Bureau. It has been communicated to the groups. You should all have been informed of this. I'd like to welcome Szydło very warmly to the Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been decided that there will be a debate on the decision of the Commission to introduce a dialogue on the question of the rule of law and strengthening it in Poland. This is the first time a debate such as this has taken place in this Parliament. This is, moreover, a new instrument. There has never been such a debate. This instrument did not exist until March 2014 and has not been invoked previously. It's an early warning system so that if we wish to debate on the division of powers, on rule of law and so forth, which are integral and fundamental pillars of our European Union, then we have an opportunity to do so. It is therefore a central debate for the future development of the European Union. We're going to work in a very focused manner and on the basis of complete and total mutual respect, I am sure. Once again, I would reiterate my welcome to Szydło, Prime Minister of Poland, and my thanks to her for being ready to participate in this debate. We shall now move on to the debate itself. It is my pleasure to give the floor to the Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, Mr. Koenders, on behalf of the Council.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The European Union is not only a coin or a market, it is also a union built on common values. The EU treaties are eloquent and crystal clear. Article 2 states the values on which this union is founded and reaffirms that these values are common to all member states. Membership in our union does not only entail benefits but also responsibilities. Among the foremost responsibilities of each member state is the respect for the Union's fundamental values, and notably the rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights. It is what makes us as member states, but also as Union, unique in the world. These values are shared not only because they are written on paper, but because they have been brought to life in our pluralistic and open societies over the last decades, sometimes against stiff opposition. They are fundamental because they ensure essential guarantees for the freedom of our citizens and the functioning of our democracies. However, neither the rule of law nor other fundamental values can be taken for granted. This continent brought forth the three most deadly and venomous political doctrines we know. Our ancestors have fought over these doctrines and finally overcame them. We have learned our lessons the hard way. And we have vowed countless times that we would never return to those dark days, that we would build a new community on this continent where freedom and peace would reign. We have been successful in this endeavour, and the secret to that success is that we put democracy and the rule of law first. Then and today, it remains crucial that we continue to do so. Ensuring the respect is a constant challenge to which governments must live up. And yet, we must be honest. No one country has the monopoly on virtue, and no one country has the monopoly on vice. We all have deficiencies, but the true strength of our democracies is that we can identify these deficiencies, debate them, acknowledge them, and fix them. That is what democracy is all about. This also implies that we are ready to have open discussions about the best way to protect these values in times of change. Today's debate, in which the